what we're trying to do this evening is to think about the role of business, the responsibility of business. And of course, when we invited Mark Reed, the chief executive of WPP, the world's largest advertising company, and a company that by its nature has relationships with so many of the world's biggest companies, it was going to be an opportunity for us to talk about purpose and the responsibility of business in the context of the broader debate as it happened at the beginning of 2020 around climate and business's impact on society. It's clear to us now that actually there's a debate around the purpose of business, the responsibility of business, that goes much further and goes directly to the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm extremely grateful to Mark that he's joined us, and I'm going to hand over to him in a moment and talk a little about what we're facing and how WPP and the clients that he's working with are handling it. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how a digital think-in works so that we can make sure that we hear from as many people as possible in the course of the next hour. So we have an hour. You'll see along the bottom of the screen that there are a number of little tabs. There's one that says participants and one that says chat. And the thing that's really important in a think-in is to try and hear from as many people as possible. It's intended to be like an open news meeting where people share their experience, share their expertise. So we have one rule in a think-in, and that is no questions. We want to hear your point of view. We want to hear your experience of what's happening, in this case, in business in terms of its impact on people and the planet. So in order to do that digitally, there are two ways that you can weigh in. One is there's this chat function. If you type in on the chat, you'll be able to say what you think, share a point of view. My colleague Basha Cummings is there and is going to be also answering. Here she is. Look, hello, there's Basha Cummings. She'll make sure that your comments are responded to. I'm going to pick up on them too, and I'll probably try and come to you in the course of the conversation. The second thing, just to let you know, is that you can also wave at me, digitally wave at me. So if you look at the bottom of the tab, there's also something that says participants. If you click on the tab that says participants, you'll see the list of everyone who's online comes up. But better still, you'll also see that there is a little tab that says raise hand. And if you raise your hand, a little blue digital hand comes up, and that way I can see that you want to say something and weigh in. Ideally, do it with your video enabled as well, and then we'll see you as well as talk to you. So I'm going to just test whether or not you are listening to all of that, because it's quite complicated. Chat is there. Look, we've got Heather McGowan from Boston who's joined us. That's great. Veronica's here. She's coming from Fulham. It's great to have everyone here. Thank you for joining on the chat. But I'm going to ask a question and see whether we can use the raise hand function just to have a test of the fact that everyone knows how it works. Who here thinks that business will fundamentally change as a result of the coronavirus pandemic? i.e., that the way in which business's responsibility in terms of its contribution to tax and the state, the way in which we think about air travel and meetings, the way in which we think about offices, the way in which we think about our working lives will forever be changed by what we're seeing at the moment, or whether or not, like so many of these things, it's a crisis, but in the end, actually, the way in which businesses operate, we regard our jobs, that won't fundamentally be changed by what we're seeing at the moment. Who here thinks it will be fundamentally changed? Please raise your hand. We can see all of those. Very good. Okay. Wow, the majority of people think it will fundamentally change things. Okay, well, let me say, please lower your hands if you raised your hands. If anyone wants to just make a point about why they think business will fundamentally change, please let me know. If you just raise your hand, if you just want to give a sense of why it will fundamentally change. I'm going to come, if I may, to Nicola Stanhope. You see him on the line. I'm going to ask you to view, but let's take Lizzie's iPad if she's there. Let me see if you're there. There you are. Lizzie, can we hear you? Why do you think business will fundamentally change as a result? We should be able to hear you.
Yeah, hi. Sorry.
Yes, you are.
I think I'm there now. I mean, I just think that just given my small experience of the last few days, week, that just the sort of ability for us all, well, not all of us, but so many people to do what they do from home. And just, I mean, I listened to the lunchtime thinking, and one of the things that occurred to me about one of the things you said was that I was listening to the Today programme this morning, and there was the sort of chairman of the British Olympic Committee, and he was talking about the decision that was going to be made sometime today about whether or not the Olympics took place. And I thought, in the normal world before COVID, he would have been on a plane to Japan to make that decision, or to attend a meeting about anything particularly important. But the fact is, I'm assuming that they made that, you know, they all had a conference call. And that's just one sort of tiny example of the fact that, you know, do people really need to be jumping on a plane?
Yes.
You know, to do something which could have effectively be done from the, you know, from their various, you know, offices, or not offices, but their sort of, you know, they're not, you know, their countries.
Even homes, I expect that's right. Liz, thank you. I'm going to come, Nicola, stand up. Yes, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You think too that things will change fundamentally?
I do. We've heard so much from our HR departments over the years in management about how important our people are. And we all go, yeah, they're really important. I think finally people will get the message, and our people are what the businesses are, and treating our people well and making sure that when we get out of this, we've got good people who are committed to our businesses, and I don't mean that in a cynical sense, then I think business really will change, and hopefully that will obviously be a change for the better.
I think that's interesting. I'm also struck, Nicola, that I think you're right. There's going to be a rethinking about the way in which companies relate to their people. I'm struck that in the chat column here, Martin Ricks is already raising the question of the relationship between people and their companies, particularly around the gig economy and the fact that people's circumstances are so very different in their relationship with their businesses. So I'm going to come, I can see Martin Rich's hand is up. I might come to you if I may in a moment, Martin. But actually, I was going to start very directly, Mark, with you, if I might, by just asking how a company like WPP is changing in the day-to-day operations, how you're working differently, what your clients are asking from you that's different.
You know, I was thinking, this is like, as you zoom in, this is like the world's biggest experiment in, like, through the keyhole.
It is, yes.
If you like. But at the same time, it is, I'd say, the biggest, you know, disruption in the way people's lives, of, you know, in the way we work, live, communicate, fly. You know, my kids are 8 and 10, educate our children. I mean, every single aspect of our lives is going to be turned on our head more digitally than it has before. And I don't think, you know, every sort of event of this, the world comes out changed. You know, it did in 08, 09. It will come out changed in this way. And I think it's trite to list all the things we know. We know what they are, but we shouldn't forget that they are. People will fly less, shop more online, communicate using video more than they did using regular telephone. Our kids will get used to, you know, a lot of, I don't know if I classify as old, but a lot of people weren't allowed to work from home because their older bosses didn't trust them to work from home. Now the older bosses are learning what it's like to work from home, that you can be effective when you work from home. Companies are going to have very different social things. You know, we at WPP, we've been through a kind of tsunami of changes. So we had China in sort of February, and that moved on to Milan, to Italy. We had 2,500 people in Italy, sort of in early, I guess, late February, early March. And then we took the decision last Saturday to basically send all of our 110,000 people all around the world to work from home wherever they could. And, you know, we really thought long and hard about whether that was the right thing to do. But I think we took the view that, you know, the safety of our people was paramount. And actually, I'm pleased that we did, because most of the world has moved there. But I think in many cases, business has moved ahead. Maybe large companies find it easier. Large companies have moved ahead in terms of government. But it's not an easy thing to say, we're going to send 110,000 people to work from home. And today, or yesterday when we looked, you know, I think we had 30 people who were working out of our office in London, and a similar number out of 4,000 in New York. So I think all around the world, about 93% of our people are working from home. In China, we're back up at 55%. So I think the way we work has changed. We're having to trust people much more. I think also I've seen a much greater degree of collaboration across the company. So one of the things we're trying to do at WPP from a strategic perspective is go from being a group to being a company. And actually, like all kind of adverse events, it forces you to make changes. And I've seen people come together in ways they've never come together. I did a video call on Monday morning. We had 1,700 people like this from all across Italy. You know, a month ago, I'd have felt I had to fly to Milan to see them. Now I can communicate with them in this way. So look, I don't think we can underestimate the impact of the change that we'll have.
And Mark, just explain, so WPP has asked everyone to go home, even if they're in countries that are not facing a lockdown or even particularly close to a lockdown. Is that right?
Yes, because I think we took the view that countries that are not yet in a lockdown will be in a lockdown at some point soon. You know, India have moved into that situation, and therefore it's better just to get people used to working in this way. Now, China, you know, and Singapore, we've sort of to some extent come out the other side. So I think in those markets it's a bit different, but basically globally we sent everyone home. Now, our challenge is our offices are our factories, right? We're not like a manufacturer. You have office workers and factory workers. Our offices are our factories. So there are jobs which, you know, production, creative jobs that are hard to do. But I'd say people, you know, are managing. It's not easy for people. You know, a lot of the average age of someone at WPP is 30. Many of them live alone. Yes. You know, coming into work is the time when they see other people. So not coming into work is difficult for people. So we're trying to encourage people to have, you know, morning video calls, evening video calls. And then we've now got the added complexity that we're all struggling with, you know, who's looking after the kids? Well, one of us is on a video conference.
Yeah. And Mark, just tell us a bit about the relationship then, the actual work that you're trying to do, because I imagine that we're all consuming a huge amount of media. There's a colossal need to communicate effectively, both from governments, but also from businesses. And presumably your clients are coming and saying, look, we'd like WPP to, you know, produce us a new ad, craft a new message, help us on a strategy. Is that happening? Are you being swamped by work, or is everything sort of frozen and people just recycling the stuff they've previously had?
No, look, I think we sort of think a bit about demand and we think a bit about supply. So I'd say, you know, the immediate focus was supply. You know, can we get the workforce working properly? Can we create work? And I'd say we're sort of 90% making that operational. I worry about how we maintain the tempo in the business if this goes on for 3 or 4 months. But I think if we do it for short periods of time and we can get through it, then I think it's fine. In terms of demand, you know, things differ like they do in life. You know, airlines and hotel companies find things very difficult. Packaged goods companies, you know, look back and understand the need to invest during this period of time. I think what we say to clients is they have to communicate, you know, responsibly and in the right way, and they have to be seen not to take advantage of the situation, but to do the right thing by their consumer. And actually, I wrote an op-ed for Campaign magazine today to say that what our industry does has never been more important than it is today. And actually, we're not spending our time discussing first-party data and personalization at scale. We're discussing old-fashioned things like creativity, what people think, why they think that, what are their emotions, what are their fears, how would they react to something, is this appropriate? So lots of sort of things that maybe feel a little bit dismissed about the advertising business are actually becoming much more important. At the same time, we know we're going to have to express them in all sorts of different ways. And so there are many examples of clients doing things from, you know, Unilever making soap available and pursuing encouraging people to wash their hands, through to Nike making their Nike Run Club available to free, to supermarkets as we've seen creating special hours. We run hackathons with clients to work out ways of sort of creating these in new ways. And I'd say all businesses, from small to big, are just innovating. And that, I mean, that is fantastic. Right? We've seen a degree of innovation in 3 weeks, probably more than we've seen in the preceding 3 years in what people do and how they think of it.
And Mark, one thing, people often come to or look to WPP, certainly advertising businesses generally, as a barometer of the way in which the economy more broadly is going, that advertising, if you like, is a leading indicator. And it's very, very hard for anyone to tell how bad this is going to be for the economy more generally. But do you have a sense of it? Do you have a sense of the scale of the downturn we're looking at?
I don't do. I don't, and I think it sort of would be irresponsible to forecast what would happen, because I think if this is a 4-week thing and we get through the other side, I think we'd all be in a very in a great situation. You know, the trouble with this situation is it's both a health. In what we said earlier, this is both a healthcare crisis and a financial crisis. And I think what companies struggle with is how we protect, not only our people's health, but we have to protect their jobs, because we want to have a company. We have 113,000 people around the world. We want as many of those people to have a job when we come out of this as, at the end, as we do at the beginning. And so balancing those two things, was very difficult. I think actually when governments make decisions for companies, it becomes a bit easier. So when governments say, we saw Sports Direct fall into line quite quickly this morning.
Yes.
And when governments make decisions, it's easier. And I think that I can't say, what the impact will be. I think if it's short, we'll see this V-shaped. I think what we have to do is limit, the economic disruption. It will be if the economy could sort of shrink perfectly by 20% for 3 months and expand in the same structure, it would be great, right? You imagine everyone, wages went down 20%, rents went down 20%, everything went down 20%. We all came back out the other side, having done probably 20% less work, but spent 20% less money. Would all be great. But unfortunately, life doesn't work that way. And there will be dislocations. Companies will, run out of money. I think a lot of small businesses will find life very tough, and things will come back. But I think that's difficult.
I mean, I'm struck. There's a note, Mark, here in the chat from Carlin. I think is Carlin Greenfield saying, actually, these moments are moments of innovation, that people really do change the way they operate. It says here that the Harvard Innovation Lab Ingenuity Awards, it's estimated about 30% of the top policies have come out of crisis. So there is something to hold on to there. By the way, just to say, everyone, please do weigh in. If you've joined not right at the start, I just remind you that if you want to raise your hand and speak up, click on the participants tab at the bottom of the main screen, and at the bottom of that participants list, you'll see there's a little grey box that says raise hand, and then I'll come to you as quickly as I can. I just, as people are sort of gathering their thoughts, Mark, I just also wanted to ask you about the question I asked right at the beginning, which was not just about whether or not our business habits will change, whether we go to work, how we travel, how we communicate with each other, but whether or not the relationship between business and society will change. And if you're looking at the comments in the sidebar here, you'll realize that some of the frustration that I think has built up and was funneled into the arguments about purpose, certainly about climate, is obviously going to find expression in the COVID-19 crisis, when people say we fundamentally need to rethink the place of business in society. I just wondered whether you'd reflect on that for a minute, because there is also a view that actually people are going to become, if you like, much more clear that a job really matters to them. And when a recession, if a recession does hit, actually all of the broader purpose gets shelved, and people think we want a business to make money so that it makes sure that my job is secure. Which way do you think things are going to go?
Well, look, I may be naive, but I like to think that there shouldn't be a conflict between profit and purpose in a company. I think the way that you behave is as important as what you do, or what you do is the evidence of the way that you behave or the way that you think. I think when you look at trust studies, although consumer trust in business overall, is relatively low, the thing that consumers trust more than anything else is their employer. They trust their employer, I think, more than the government, all the other things. So actually, I think people do have a lot of trust in the people that employ them, and I think employers have a lot of trust in their people. So I think that's the careful thing that we need to manage. So hopefully, we have to navigate our way through this as best we can. And I think that companies that do the right thing and behave in the right way will come out ahead of those that don't. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to come to Martin Ricks and a couple of the others who've made comments, if I may. Martin, are you there? Yes, hello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, far away.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I've made a few comments on the chat, but I think the most of the innovation that was being discussed just now, I think is coming out of the Treasury at the moment, and I think that might be the fundamental change that we see over the next few years. A lot of the things that have been talked about in terms of the gig economy and about protecting those kind of workers and people on 0-hour contracts and things like that. I think that will be the change that we will see with business. It's worked so far for people, but all of a sudden when things go wrong, it's quite clear that those kind of employment statuses don't work. But I have been pondering this over the last few days, and I wonder whether we are going to see now maybe a shift towards things like UBI and the 4-day week, and those kind of policy ideas that were put around over the last couple of years, particularly in the run-up to the last election, but weren't really taken seriously. Is that the kind of thing we're going to see now? And then the biggest thing for me is, are we going to see a fundamental change in how we view tax in this country? So people were pointing towards Denmark and the kind of things that they were doing when they were going into lockdown. And we were saying, why can't we do that? And that's because Britain has not got a very good relationship with tax. And actually, are we going to see a big shift away from that, where we do realise that the people on the lowest wages, the people that are the most precarious in their employment, they need that kind of protection. And the only way we can do that is through tax. And with that, the people we now realise are the key workers, and that's the hospital staff, that's the people that work in supermarkets, the delivery drivers, that kind of thing. So I'm wondering if that's the shift we're going to see in business, is actually a better package for employers and workers.
Martin, thanks very much. I mean, I'm struck. Someone's made a point just now, which is that some of the things that have been introduced on a short-term basis, this is someone who works in the NHS, already being considered as longer-term solutions. Do you think, just going to that point, Mark, that there are things that are going to become plausible in policy terms? I'm thinking now around the inequality debate in particular, that just weren't beforehand. I imagine if you turned up at a Conservative Party conference and said, what do you think of universal basic income? The idea that the state should ensure that everyone maintains at least a level of wages and salaries, you wouldn't have had much of a reception in September of last year. But this year, it's going to be a much more live debate, that question. So do you think there'll be a fundamental change? Because that will, as Martin says, have an impact on the way we think about tax as well.
Well, look, I think that clearly in this country we have a national health service, and so I think that unlike, let's say, the US, people's health is taken care of. Clearly, people are going to feel, we will be spending more in the national health service coming out of this than we did coming into it, and there'll be much less political debate around sort of levels of funding and everything else, for the health service. Clearly there's going to be a premium on resilience, both resilience in business. But look, people, I do sense there's a feeling like we're all in this together. It's like the great leveler. And I think that, I saw some work we've been doing, saying to people that are staying at home, if you're staying at home, you're doing your bit, Yes. You're doing your bit by staying at home. And I think there is that feeling, of people coming together. When I talk to our people in Milan, with the people singing, and, look, sections of the media can focus on bad behavior, but I think there's much less of that than I think there is good behavior. So clearly, I think, and there's probably going to be a large bill to pay at the end of this as well. So I think clearly people will start to rethink notions like equality, but I think it will start with health and the importance of health, because this is like, it's medieval, isn't it? It's like the plague. I mean, you don't know if you have it, there's no cure, you don't know, you can't stop yourself getting it. We haven't seen anything like this for 7 or 8 centuries, really. So I can see you can see the fear it has in people.
I do. I want to come back, Mark, to this point about it being a great leveler. Before I do, just one thing to say: there's an amazing stream of really interesting points being made in the chat function, if it's all coming at you a little too fast, one thing to say is that we do provide an edited version of it all in the Tortoise app. I know that lots of people on here are Tortoise members. If you're not already a Tortoise member, you can take a 30-day free trial. Just go to the App Store, put in Tortoise, and you'll be able to get the edited version, as well as all the other things we do, SenseMaker and Tortoise Files and the Slow News podcast. So if it's all coming at you a bit too fast, fear not. There are a bunch of people I want to come to who've got their hands up. But before I do, Mark, just this point on the leveler. I think lots of people in business will say, well, actually, there's a vast difference between being a small business, or certainly a self-employed person, and being part of a multinational. Do you see that? Do you see that big businesses are coping or responding very differently to ones that are frankly smaller clients?
I think this is a challenge for all companies, large or small. I mean, you see that in the stock market. Now, it may hit home harder for smaller business in the short term, but I think we have to think about this as a challenge, for all businesses. You look at the number of companies that are cutting their dividends, postponing share buybacks. I think there's that notion that, it brings home why people say don't leverage your business. It may only be a 1 in 100 chance that, things go wrong, but you don't want to be running the company, for the 1 in 100 chance, do you? So I think that it is going to change how people think about risk and appetite for risk, in terms of leveraging companies, and how they work with people inside the organization.
I'm going to take a few points of view, if I can, so please do stick your hand up, and I'll come to you. There's Charlie Curtis I can see here. Charlie, what do you think on this?
Thank you, James. So I wanted to come back to your question about how business is going to change as a result of this, and really think, and what Mark said about sort of profit being aligned with purpose. I think quite regularly businesses are making decisions where there's a trade-off between short-term shareholder value and societal benefit. I think what's happening right now is that trade-off is going vastly in the direction of societal benefit, maybe at the expense of short-term shareholder value for this period, to get through this period. And actually what's happening, I think the leaders now, the way they're behaving now is going to be their legacy, and is going to be remembered for years and years and years by their employees, by their customers. And I think those leaders who are now going all the way over this way and acting in society's best interests are going to find it quite hard to then come back and say, right, I'm going to go back to exactly how it was before. I think there is going to be a legacy that's going to bounce back, but I don't think it's going to bounce back all the way. I think society is going to play a bigger role, and that trade-off is going to become less about short-term shareholder value and more about long-term societal benefit. I
think it's such an interesting point, Charlie. Just before we came on here, Alan Jope at Unilever, I was looking at the post that he had done about not just providing soap, as Mark says, but also actually making 500 million pounds, I think it is, available to some of their suppliers to give them support. And there is a kind of sense of responsibility that people are taking that goes beyond just their companies. It's obviously about the society and the world we live in. And you're right, I wonder when it's all over, the way in which people think about themselves and those relationships. I'm going to come, if I can, just to Asad here, because I know you've had your hand up, or your digital hand up, for a while. Asad, what are your thoughts?
It's super interesting looking at the work that we do. So I run a consultancy called The Unmistakable,s, and we look at diversity and inclusion in the workplace, which, if we'd had this debate back in January, was all wrapped up in the purpose of businesses and what they do. And there's two things that have come out. I think one is brands seeing themselves as more of a public service than a profit-making organization in the short term. But the second bit is a bit around what does diversity and inclusion look like in the workplace, because a lot of the problems in companies comes down to microaggressions or the way people feel at work and the fact they don't feel included. But actually, rather than bringing your whole self to work, which was the mantra 3 months ago, people are bringing their whole shelf to work, and we're starting to see people in their homes, and we're seeing people for who they are, and we're seeing warts and all. And I just think there's now less of a split between work and life and being yourself. And I think the way that's going to manifest in business, if and when we all go back to offices, will be quite interesting to observe, and maybe we all will be more inclusive because we've had to be in each other's lives in both our work and our life.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a comment here, Asad, about how we deal with kind of real life issues in our businesses. Tarek Shirley's made this actually really rather brilliant point. Each of my last 3 employers experienced once in 100 year, once in a century events. These are coming thick and fast, and risk management needs to adapt. I don't know whether Mark, I know you're relatively new actually as the CEO of WPP. It just strikes you that actually the scale of the things that you're dealing with are not what we thought of 10 years ago as the requirements, or maybe 25 years ago as the requirements of a chief executive. You're dealing with things that are much more about, you know, public policy and social responsibility than just the operations of the business. Is that wishful thinking that's the case, or does it feel that way?
No, I mean, look, well, it's been an interesting 2 years. I can tell you in many respects. But look, I think, you know, you deal with, as a CEO, with public policy issues. You know, we deal with, you know, we had a global cyber attack about 3 years ago that, you know, wiped out 70,000 people's computers, you know, in 20 minutes. So I'd say that the way that business is so interconnected means the volatility of events is much bigger, and when you have much higher, or let's say, much higher variance. So, you know, we're not used to managing in volatile events. Certainly not here in, you know, the US and Great Britain. We get bailed out by the central bank when things go wrong. You know, if you work in Brazil or Turkey or markets like that, they see these situations as fantastic opportunities to, you know, swoop on their long-held competitor that wasn't well managed or whatever. You know, we see them as they are, which is stressful events, but less as, let's say, business opportunities. But I do think the variance is getting higher, and the interconnectedness is revealing new sort of linkages in the economy that had not been clear to us. Right. Been talked about, you know, the China-US linkage. You know, clearly Apple can't get product from China. You know, it's not a great thing. So, you know, we all sort of said, well, the next thing that happens will come from nowhere, and we turned out to be completely right, didn't we?
Oh, exactly, absolutely. Colin, I mentioned what Colin Greenfield said at the outset. Hello, Colin. And I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about innovation.
Yeah, so I've been working on public policy and migration innovation actually in Latin America. So I think the point on there being a very different view in the global south, or in less maybe places where you have a government to bail you out, is spot on, very true, and how things are getting innovated there. And so I think when we're talking about this, I don't know, the role of the government and the role of these businesses, we are really focused in our bubble, right, of the United States, of the UK, of where, well, the government will step in. Well, the businesses will follow what the government says is best, right? You saw so many businesses say, we're going to wait for Public Health England to tell us what to do. And that's just not the case in other countries. In Colombia, for instance, we have a lot of businesses saying, how are we going to innovate this? How are we going to make sure that this isn't a massive loss if we don't have a government safety net there, if we don't have a social security net under us? So I think when we're thinking about businesses and innovation, we should also be looking elsewhere in places where businesses have much bigger responsibilities to society.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the combination of the two, I think in my colleague, Chris Cook, is thinking about exactly this, the extent to which business culture has changed the way in which we think about public policy and government. And my colleague, Matt Dancona, is actually looking at how all of this will change the sort of center of gravity in politics. So I think those are really key subjects. I'm going to, Bobby Banerjee, you had your hand up for a bit. Hello, are you there? Yes, you are.
Can you hear?
Can hear you well, yes.
How are you doing?
Good.
Yeah. I came in a bit late, but I've been following the chat as well. I guess my comment was slightly taking the bigger picture. As someone once said, never waste a crisis.
Yes.
Obama did waste the crisis when it came. He had both the houses under his control, but the financial crisis didn't lead to any major structural changes. My question is, so what? I mean, if you look at positives that have come out of this virus. If you saw the story in The Guardian, those pictures of air pollution coming down, the CO2 coming down. I'm asking doing a thought experiment. What if this is permanent? What kind of world would we need to reimagine where the 250,000, whatever, the 50,000 volunteers the NHS asks for is a permanent occupation that comes under GDP? What would it take to design an economy where there's 40% unemployment in the way we currently measure unemployment? What is the meaning of work? What would happen if the world is going to be like this for the next 60, 70, 100 years? How would we live? I think those are the kind of questions we should be asking.
Well, I'm gonna cut you off, not because the substance of what you're saying isn't great, because it's as substantial as it gets, but because unfortunately the sound quality is not ideal. But I take what you're saying, which is what happens if this is one of those moments where we rethink the way in which everything works, the way in which society works, what we expect of government works. I'm interested to try and see if we can, think a little long term about this, because we've talked so far about how businesses are behaving differently, how our habits are going to change, what the expectations will be. But we originally pulled this together to think about responsibility of business. My colleague Alexandra Musavizadeh pulled together a team at Tortoise Intelligence, which produces the Responsibility 100 Index, which maps business performance against the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And we've looked at the FTSE 100 companies against those UN SDGs. I don't want us to lose sight, exactly as you say, Bobby, of some of those really big questions, which is, could you do something fundamentally different in terms of not just halting, but even reversing climate change? And what does business do in contributing to that? I can see that Giles Gibbons is on the line. I think you're there. Yeah. Giles, I wanted to come to you because, I know you're old and you've worked on sort of the idea of good business and business purpose for a fair while now. Do you think that this thing could be an inflection point, that business purpose changes as a result of this?
I think it's going to be an evolutionary point, weirdly, not an inflection point. I think we're on a fairly fast journey anyway, and I think this will help speed that process on. I suppose one of the reflections that I would make, and I'm sorry to sort of go back to the short term, but I think it makes a longer term point, is I've been incredibly surprised how companies have seen the coronavirus as an HR issue. First and foremost, not a responsibility issue. Whereas I genuinely believe that the way in which organizations behave, not just with their people, but with their consumers, with the financial community, with government, and the decisions that they make in emergency will be remembered for years to come. And I think it's now that businesses need to really think hard about who they are and what they are, and behave in not just a sort of do-gooding way, as in, yes, we're going to give some soap to a community, etc., in the short term, but actually what's the real DNA of how they're making decisions and how those decisions are going to impact all their stakeholders in the current emergency. And I think they will come out of this process with a label of being a good or bad business that will be with them for many years to come. So I do think that this is just a progression of many of the discussions that we've had about how people are impacting on and making decisions around climate change, the speed of transformation that people are hoping and looking for companies to deliver, not just on climate change, but also on inequality and other issues. So I think this is just another issue, and I know it is an enormous issue and incredibly urgent, but I do think that they're all adding up to the same point that you're trying to get across in the Responsibility 100, which is, do these organizations have the real DNA to make the right decisions for themselves, but also for the broader society? And will people support them as a good business as a result of it?
Giles, thanks. Mark, can I put that to you? Because I imagine, tell us a little bit about the conversations you're having, because I imagine the CEOs of some very big businesses are talking to you now. Are they, to Giles's point, having that conversation that says, okay, we've got a working from home issue, we've clearly got a set of cost issues, but we've also got a, how do we express who we are in the world, and a sense of what our purpose is in terms of helping, not do good, but the way in which we operate in the world. Do people have the bandwidth even to have that conversation right now?
So I'd say, clearly the first response of any company is to deal with its people and its customers, and you're drinking from a fire hose of things to do and decisions to make. And so clearly, I think Charles is right. Companies have been seen to take action on their people first and their customers sort of second, and at the same time. I think that's natural. And I think for longer term policy things, clearly, we're all looking at curves these days. The curve, I think we'll see an inversion, of interest in and action taken on purpose. And certainly the clients that we're talking to, I don't think, they're a bit like the policymakers. It's like contain, they're not yet thinking what they do when they come out the other side. But I'm sure when they come out the other side, they're going to be asking us, what do consumers think? What do they feel? What do they want to do? Now, consumers, when we come out the side, there'll be different groups. Some, will want to have a massive celebration. Others, their life will be impacted. They'll have lost loved ones. They'll have lost their jobs. They'll feel, very differently about many things. So I think we have to be, we have to understand what they're going to be like and how they're going to come out the other side of it. And I think that how companies, this is like, I hesitate to use the word opportunity, but let's call it, this is the time. This is the time for companies to demonstrate how they want to behave and how they want to be judged, and to live with their decisions. When the supermarkets open, for an hour for pensioners or NHS workers, people judge, is that effective? If it's total chaos, it's just an action. If they can make it work, it's extremely valuable. So I think that businesses, I think, ultimately depend on customers. Every business depends on its customer. So I think that and customers care about it, influenced by different things. I think it will lead to an acceleration.
But and Mark, I'm aware, or sort of nervous, in fact, that we're being too soft on business, particularly big business, because I think a lot of people are also going to be thinking, actually, the first thing the companies are going to do is they're going to see the fall off in demand for their products. Things are going to be closed, and they're going to cut a lot of jobs, and a lot of people are going to find that the result of this is that they pay for it in a very real way. And it's all very well for us to have this conversation about trust in business, but isn't there actually quite likely to be a backlash against companies that are laying people off? And the result is going to be that rather than seeing, as we saw, rather like the financial crisis, there's going to be a fury with business rather than a greater trust in your employer.
Well, I think, again, that depends on how business behaves. I mean, it's clear that companies will have to at some point adjust, their cost to their revenues, and
yeah, exactly.
But I think I'd say several things. One is the way you go about it, is important. I'd say secondly, in those markets, these are, things people have been thinking about. In those markets where healthcare isn't provided, you provide healthcare. And I think actually, certainly, I think management teams across big businesses are thinking of ways of, the problem is the uncertainty. Is this a 3-month event? Is it a 1-year event? It's very hard to know exactly what to do. So, I think that companies will try to do the right thing, but at the same time, I agree with you. I think that we're not all of a sudden going to throw profit out the window as the motivation for a company. I don't think we should be naive, but I think that at the same time, I think that companies do provide a valuable role in society. We provide people with jobs and income, and let's not forget that part of it either, really.
No, I agree. I'm gonna come to Tarek shortly, because you made a point earlier, Tarek. What were you going to say?
It was around risk management, but I think I'd be interested just to hear, Mark, which businesses do you think do have a good model in their DNA whereby they will adapt to the new normal. And I guess that's down to not just the sort of tactics on the day-to-day front of sort of appearing to be kind, but actually, thinking longer term and having a sort of kindness strategy that will see them through the crisis. But clearly, keeping profit as an idea and returns to shareholders, but sort of thinking more broadly. Do you have some examples of frameworks or models, or even companies that you think are doing the right things across the board?
I mean, I hesitate to single out particular companies. My observation would be that technology companies move very quickly on this. It's much easier to move when you've got $200 billion of cash on your balance sheet and 50% operating margins than when you're, let's say, a business that's not in that strong financial position. I think if you look at James's index, the Tortoise Index, I think the CEOs of companies I talk to, I don't want to highlight Alan on his own, but I think companies like Unilever do think about this very fundamentally. I think companies like GSK think about this very fundamentally. So I think there are businesses, and within the technology industry, I think they are in the main, trying to do the right thing, but they have struggled with, as we know, content versus monetization, good versus bad. So it's not easy.
Heather McGowan, you there? Heather, hello. Hi there. What do you think on this front, particularly on the broader sort of responsibility question?
Yeah, so I raised my hand a while ago on a slightly different point, but I'll connect it back. I'm in the U.S., so my perspective is American, and I just wrote an article in Forbes yesterday about how the coronavirus is accelerating our adaptation into the future of work. So something that would have taken 5 to 7 years for people to scale up an online education or remote working or other aspects of digitizing their business, they're now doing it in 5 to 7 days. The Business Roundtable last summer in the US, which is a collection of all our top CEOs, declared that the purpose of a business was no longer strictly to return money to shareholders, but it had a deeper meaning to all stakeholders, particularly employees and the communities in which they live. Now they're getting a stress test on that, which I think is very interesting. And a lot of companies are stepping up, as you've all mentioned, in really interesting ways. And then the third point I wanted to make is the silver lining I see on this, and I think this is the launch point for a bigger discussion, because you've all kind of nibbled around the edges of it, is I'm almost 50 years old. This is the third moral test, I think, in my lifetime. And in the last half century, we've had climate change. Earth Day was in 1970. Global warming has gone up astronomically since then. The 5 hottest years on record were in the last 10, in the last 5, I'm sorry, and the 10 hottest were in the last 15. We've failed there. Income inequality has been skyrocketing in terms of the Gini coefficient, particularly in the US since the 1970s, through every administration, right and left. We've failed here. And both of those things are coming to light as we're all in our homes, we're seeing, carbon emissions lower in China. We're seeing opportunities that this pandemic has created. But in this particular pandemic, we've decided to put our most vulnerable humans before our economy. And there's something in that moment that's really uplifting when we think about how we restart the economy when we're done with this. The decisions that we made, which are causing a world of hurt, especially at the small business level and at the individual level, we are prioritizing the people who probably contribute the least to our economy over our economy. Yeah. Our seniors, our elders, our most vulnerable. And in that, I find some optimism that there's a way to sort of look at these 3 moral tests together as we restart the economy. So that was just the point I wanted to make.
Heather, thank you for that. There is, I'm going to come right to Marcia. You there? Hello. Marcia, you've had your hand up for a while, so I just wanted to hear what was on your mind.
Well, first, I am very touched by all of the comments, which are so insightful about the moment that we find ourselves in. I am group head of corporate responsibility for a company called Relax. We are pleased to be a top 20 finisher, if you will, in your Tortoise 100 Responsibility Index. And I think if there was ever a moment, my role as group head of corporate responsibility, if there was ever a moment when we needed to connect corporate purpose to addressing the needs of our communities, it's now and it's playing out. In our case, we have a free resource center, the RELX SDG Resource Center, and a few of our businesses have created free resource centers within that. So the Lancet, for example, and you can get up to the minute news on the crisis, or as soon as it's put out and it gets onto the resource center. I mean, I think companies have to figure out what are we good at and how can we use that to address this crisis. We are going to be hit considerably because we have a very large events business. But what my colleagues in Austria are doing is converting a space that's usually used for exhibitions to a temporary hospital. So I think the question is, I was recently talking to somebody in financial services, this is about 3 weeks ago, about ESG, and they were concerned about whether this was going to be something that's for the good times or if ESG really matters for the long term. And actually what we see, I mean, BlackRock, which is the largest investor in our company and many others, sent a note around this week saying that they are staying the course on ESG because it's going to help to determine the long-term viability of companies, so that ESG still needs to be a key criteria in evaluating the long-term sustainability of a company, and I find that quite important for the future.
That is, that's really interesting. And in fact, for those people who don't necessarily follow ESG, environment, society and governance, the measures beyond just financial performance that companies are increasingly held to, that's really interesting. We'll make sure that we look into that, because the real question with a company like BlackRock is not just what Larry Fink says, obviously, in his letters, but also then the extent to which they follow up in their investment decisions. I'm going to try and take a few more points before I go back. Sonu Singh, are you there? Yes, you are. Hello. Hello, can we hear you? Yes, we can.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, can. Fine, yes.
Yes, sorry, this working from home does mean that if you have a 13-year-old, you have to ask him to stop gaming at the same time so they can stream what you're doing. I wanted to talk about the, because a lot of you actually have shared some rather optimistic thoughts, I think, but also you've used, words like purpose and words like businesses being responsible. For me, this really is the perfect storm for leadership, and indeed, whether James, it's yourself running something like Tortoise, which I greatly admire, and Mark running WPP. It's not a challenging time that any one of you obviously asked for, but indeed, it's not just social isolation. We have the pandemic, and there will be an economic downturn as well. And we haven't really seen the kind of sort of leadership styles that would come out, which not really looking for answers, but something that leads us to believe, particularly in businesses. And I think I was quite struck by this one particular example, which was Brewdog. For those of whom you haven't actually seen it, on social media, they've been trying to do some quite fascinating social enterprise ideas. One of them being obviously using their factories, their breweries to manufacture sanitizers. Another one being they're using some of the lorries that they have to try and go to remote areas and bring food and other necessary items. But what has been interesting to watch is the response it has had from the communities, and the response has been rather negative, and that's because the kind of reputation the brand and the business owners have had in the past. And I just wonder, in terms of the kind of the leadership style and the kind of businesses, are we really expecting that kind of trust to happen, say, in the next few weeks, few months, depending on the course and the trajectory that businesses take? There is a lot of talk of.
I think it's a really really good question, because it can obviously go either way, can't it? And it seems to me a good place to come back to you, Mark, as we kind of come towards the end of our time here. You get asked a lot about the clients of WPP, but actually for the company itself, and when you think of your role in leading that company, what do you want WPP to do to contribute during this crisis?
So, we spoke, I sort of be careful what I say, because I don't want to fall guilty of marketing myself in the same way. But, about 3 weeks ago, we spoke to an international health body, and I said, look, every single resource you want from WPP is available to you, for free. We're going to have, people have been pretty busy actually, but, any form of communication, anything you do, any connections with our clients, we'll make that available. And look, I think in one way I did it because I think it's the right thing to do, but also because I think it really engages our people, and our people want to, like people do, want to contribute, and they want to use their skills to do that. So we're working, I know, here, we have a great idea in Italy for a book to come out when we're through this. We're working in the US, 99% pro bono work, helping, because it's actually in many ways I think this is a communication crisis, right? Actually, in many ways, the reason that people have been anxious is because they're not entirely sure that this is all under control, and they know what's expected of them. So I think that actually it's incumbent on leaders to communicate clearly to people, that there is a plan, that we know what they want, that we know what they want them to do. It's clear. I was talking to a client today who runs pharmacies. It's not clear to her, what are essential workers, what are not essential workers. So communications can play a vital role, I think, in reducing people's anxiety and helping them behave in the right way. And ultimately, that's what we need people to do. We need people to stay at home for the next 3 weeks. And the more people that stay at home the next 3 weeks, the better, speaking with someone in the UK, the better we will come out at the end of it. So, I think that there's a lot that we can do. And I view that as both the right thing to do, but also I think our people, find it, I don't know, motivating is not the right word, but you understand what I mean. Our people want to do it.
Well, Mark, thank you. I mean, if you've been to a ThinkIn before, you'll know at the end, the job of the editor, in this case me, but could be one of our other editors, has to try and pull together a point of view, the Tortoise take, if you like. And to be honest with you, I find this incredibly difficult at this time, because there's so much is moving, so many of the questions we've got, there are simply not answers to. And as Mark pointed out early on, one of the issues here is we just don't know how long the whole crisis will run for, and the impact it will have. But if I can, I'd stand back and say sort of two fundamental things about business and the way it impacts on society and culture. One is, I think we started with some really practical points, and the practical is very significant. The extent to which we do get used to operating online, that we do get used not to flying, we do get used to working on video. The points that you made, Mark, at the top are actually really significant, because they will fundamentally change behaviors. And things like offices and meetings and working from home and the culture that goes with it will change profoundly as a result. So I think that we can sort of skip past some of those practical things and not necessarily internalize quite how profoundly they're going to change the way in which we live and work. But then I think there's been a whole second tier of discussion, and I suppose, Heather, you touched upon it in terms of the moral crises of our lives, and I think Giles Gibbons touched upon it too, in terms of the way in which business culture changes, and that I think is perhaps best reflected by the fact that we've talked a lot this evening about decisiveness in business, the decision to put 110,000 people or ask 110,000 people to work from home, the willingness to make a decision, the scale of resolve that we're seeing now. We're talking about the way the government is stepping in on supporting on salaries and tearing up a rule book on policy, as Martin Ricks pointed out right at the top. And the point that Carlin made, which was actually in these crises, and a point that's been echoed in the chat, in these crises, you see a level of innovation, a willingness to do new things. I suppose what you'd point to there in that decisiveness, in that resolve, in that innovation, is a willingness to take on exactly the big issues that I think Heather and other people have talked about, particularly the willingness to put the vulnerable and think about those people, address the inequality issue, address the climate issue. And that's the reason why I hope it's made sense to go ahead with the conversation we planned tonight with Mark Reed to talk about responsible business. As we've touched upon, we did this in coordination with the fact that we release the next quarter of the Responsibility100 Index. If you go into the Tortoise app or the Tortoise website, you can see the latest figures for the FTSE 100 companies and the data we're using to measure the impact they're having on people and the planet. We're launching the Tortoise Responsible Business Forum because we want to try and figure out ways that we can measure the extent to which companies really are putting people and planet on a par with profit. And if you want to support what we're doing, and I hope that if you're new to Tortoise you will, please do give us a try, download the app. There's a 30-day free trial and you can see the kind of journalism that we're doing. We come to the end of this. A huge thank you to you, Mark Reed, to everyone who's joined us. All the best. Bye.